An entire civilization vanished after reversing the flow of its river. This is the true story of an ancient society that achieved the impossible, only to disappear into the sands of time. By the end of this journey, you will uncover the profound reasons why even the greatest human achievements can lead to sudden collapse. We will investigate how a monumental engineering triumph could trigger a cascade of ecological and social disasters. What critical mistake did they make that holds a dire warning for our own world today? This world was defined by a single, powerful river flowing through a sun-baked land. For centuries, the rhythm of life was dictated by the annual floods. When the waters rose, they deposited rich, fertile silt across the floodplains, creating a narrow strip of green paradise in an otherwise harsh and arid world. The people who called this place home were masters of their environment. They were not just farmers, but brilliant engineers who carved a vast network of canals into the earth, directing the river's gift to fields farther and farther from its banks. Their cities grew, their granaries swelled, and their culture flourished within this carefully managed oasis. Yet this prosperity existed in a state of perpetual tension. Just beyond the last irrigated field lay the desert, a constant reminder of how thin the line was between abundance and desolation. Every decision, every innovation was a gamble against this unforgiving landscape. It was within this pressure cooker of ambition and necessity that a radical idea was born, an idea so grand it would change the fate of their civilization forever. The river had always been their lifeblood, but now it was seen as a stubborn servant that refused to obey. The grand vision to reverse its flow was born from a perfect storm of desperation and hubris. Generations of success had created a booming population, with new cities and farmlands spreading further from the river's natural banks, yet the climate was turning against them. Years of weaker floods left their outermost canals dry and their most distant fields parched. The desert, once held at bay, began to creep back into the edges of their world. Faced with this slow, encroaching crisis, their most brilliant minds proposed a solution of breathtaking scale. Why simply channel the water when you could command the river itself to flow backwards, to push its life-giving force into every corner of their domain? This was the ultimate expression of their engineering prowess, a declaration that they were no longer subjects of their environment, but its masters. The rulers, seduced by the promise of eternal prosperity and unshakable power, gave their approval. This was not just about survival, it was about forging an empire that could defy the very laws of nature. The conception of this plan set them on an irreversible path, one that would require every ounce of their ingenuity and strength to undertake. The sheer scale of the undertaking was staggering, a societal commitment that would consume a generation. To bend a river's course required an army of labor, not of soldiers, but of diggers, masons, and basket weavers. Tens of thousands of people were likely mobilized, drawn from villages and cities across the land. Their work was a symphony of coordinated effort, a rhythm of human toil set against the desert sun. In quarries far from the river, teams hammered and chiseled at solid rock, freeing massive blocks that would form the diversion structures. Along the proposed route, countless hands wove reeds into enormous baskets, each one capable of carrying immense loads of earth. This was the true engine of the project, a slow, steady procession of workers moving the very ground beneath their feet. Feeding and housing such a colossal workforce was a logistical nightmare solved through an intricate system of tributes and taxes. Granaries from every province were tapped to supply the workers, a constant flow of bread, beer, and dates traveling along supply routes to the sprawling labor camps. This was not merely a construction project. It was the civilization's entire economy and social structure being redirected towards a single, monumental goal. The organizational genius on display, the sheer will to coordinate so many people and resources, rivals the building of the Great Pyramids. It stands as a testament to what human societies can achieve when unified by a common, overwhelming purpose. Yet this incredible mobilization also placed the entire civilization on a razor's edge, with its stability now entirely dependent on the success of this one audacious endeavor. Without a single diesel engine or steel crane, they achieved the impossible. The secret was not in the power of their tools, but in the brilliance of their strategy. They understood the river's own weight and momentum could be turned against it, using simple principles of gravity and pressure that are still fundamental to engineering today. Their primary weapons were dams and levees, massive earthen walls constructed from millions of woven baskets filled with stone and compacted clay. Think of these not as solid barriers meant to stop the water completely, but as gentle hands meant to guide and persuade it. A series of these structures would be built at key points along the river's curve, each one nudging the current incrementally, day by day, onto a subtly new course. To carve the new path itself, they dug a vast primary diversion channel. This was the river's new bed, a carefully graded trench that sloped ever so slightly downhill, ensuring the water would want to flow into it once the final levee was breached. The control of this immense force was managed with astonishing precision through a network of gravity-fed canals and wooden sluice gates. These gates acted like primitive yet effective valves. Workers could raise or lower them to regulate the water's depth and speed, directing a precise amount of flow to different regions or temporarily halting it for maintenance. The sound of the river would have changed during this process, from a familiar roar to a controlled, gurgling rush through these man-made arteries. Every bronze chisel that shaped the stone blocks for the diversion inlets, every wooden sledge that hauled earth, every calloused hand that wove the endless reed baskets was part of a single cohesive machine. Their technology was ancient, but their systems thinking was profoundly modern. They viewed the entire watershed as a single, malleable system, and they learned to reprogram it. This grand redirection of a continent's lifeblood was not an act of brute force, but one of delicate, calculated persuasion, and for a time it worked exactly as planned. The immediate results must have seemed like a miracle, a validation of their supreme effort and a new dawn for their civilization. The river now obeyed a human design. Where once there was only cracked earth and hardy desert scrub, lush green fields unfurled under the sun, the great canals, once ambitious lines on a surveyor's map, pulsed with a steady, controlled flow of water. This was the payoff, the moment where generations of backbreaking labor appeared to yield a perfect, engineered paradise. Vast territories that had been marginal and dry were suddenly the most productive farmlands in the entire civilization. Farmers could now plant and harvest 2, even 3 times a year, their granaries swelling to bursting with surplus grain. This agricultural windfall fueled everything. New towns sprang up along the artificial waterways, while the old cities grew denser and richer. The streets buzzed with merchants trading goods from newly accessible regions, and artisans, freed from the constant worry of famine, produced exquisite works of art and architecture. It was a golden age, a period of explosive population growth and cultural flourishing that must have felt like a permanent state of grace. The rulers who commissioned the project were vindicated, seen as visionary leaders who had delivered their people into an era of unprecedented security and abundance. For a few generations, it seemed they had truly conquered the desert, achieving a utopian balance where nature served human ambition without complaint. Yet this very success contained a hidden fragility. The civilization had become a perfect machine running on a single, meticulously engineered fuel source. Every aspect of their society, from the largest city to the smallest farm, was now dependent on the flawless operation of that one system. The incredible bounty they enjoyed was not a sign of a resilient relationship with the land, but of a deep and ultimately precarious specialization. The system worked so perfectly that it masked the slow, accumulating costs of their triumph. This golden age, in its very perfection, was quietly sowing the seeds of its own demise. But the river was more than just a source of water. It was the central artery of an entire living world. By forcing it into a new path, the civilization pulled a single, crucial thread from a vast ecological tapestry, and the entire pattern began to quietly unravel. Downstream, where the river's flow was suddenly diminished or cut off altogether, the consequences were catastrophic. Lush wetlands that had served as crucial spawning grounds for fish and habitats for countless birds began to shrivel and die. The rich, muddy deltas that once reached into the sea started to recede, their protective mangroves withering without fresh water. The wildlife that sustained communities and balanced the local food webs simply vanished, leaving a silent, desiccated landscape in their wake. Meanwhile, in the newly irrigated farmlands, a more insidious problem was taking root. The constant application of water in these sun-drenched plains, without the natural flushing action of the river's annual floods, began to draw ancient salts up from the earth. Slowly, invisibly, a toxic white crust started to form on the soil surface. At first, this salt was just a minor nuisance, but season after season, it accumulated, gradually poisoning the very fields that had once promised such boundless abundance. Crop yields began a slow, stubborn decline. The soil was turning against them, and then there was the problem of the silt. That precious, nutrient-rich sediment that had for millennia fertilized the natural floodplains was now trapped. It settled out in the slow-moving waters of the new canals, constantly clogging the very arteries the civilization depended on. This demanded a never-ending, exhausting cycle of dredging and maintenance, a tax of human labor that grew heavier with every passing year. Or it was swept all the way to the new river mouth, silting up harbors and disrupting coastal trade routes. The civilization had solved one massive problem, only to create a dozen smaller, slower, and more complex ones. These were not sudden disasters, but a creeping, incremental decay. The land itself was becoming exhausted, and this slow-burning ecological crisis would soon ignite a firestorm of social unrest. The life-giving water that had once been a shared gift of nature was now a tightly controlled commodity. With the river's flow dictated by human hands, a new kind of power emerged, concentrated in the elite who managed the sluice gates and canal locks. This was no longer a society bound by a collective struggle against the desert, but one divided between those who had water and those who did not. A priestly class or a royal dynasty, the very architects of the reversal, now held the ultimate leverage over every farmer, merchant, and town. Your wealth, your status, even your family's survival could be determined by your proximity to the main canals and your favor with the water administrators. Imagine a farmer watching his fields wither while his neighbor, who paid a heavier tribute to the central authority, enjoyed a steady flow. Resentment began to simmer in the sun-baked air. This stratification created a brittle society, one where the vast majority lived at the mercy of a small, powerful group. The grand project that had unified them in a common purpose was now tearing them apart. Communities located downstream from the Great Diversion Point suffered the most. Where their ancestors had known reliable seasonal floods, they now faced only a trickle or a completely dry riverbed. Their farmlands turned to dust, their fishing grounds vanished, and their way of life collapsed. It is easy to envision the tensions that must have flared, the desperate appeals for water that were denied, and the eventual conflicts that arose between the water-rich heartland and the parched periphery. The civilization was no longer fighting the desert, it was fighting itself. These deep social fractures, born from the very engineering that was meant to secure their future, created a society that was profoundly vulnerable. When the next great crisis arrived, it would find a people already divided, unable to mount a unified defense against the final, cascading collapse. Just as the civilization was straining under the weight of its own engineering, the sky itself began to turn against them. The climate, which had for so long been a predictable partner in their agricultural cycle, entered a period of profound instability. Evidence pulled from ancient lake beds and ice cores in similar regions tells a story of a world growing hotter and drier. The reliable rains that had once supplemented their grand canals became sparse and unpredictable. A prolonged drought stretching for years or even decades would have been the ultimate test for their artificial river system. That steady, controlled flow they depended on was entirely reliant on a consistent volume of water arriving from the distant headwaters. When that volume dwindled, the entire network began to starve. The wide canals became shallow streams, then muddy ditches. The carefully managed water pressure that pushed life to the farthest fields simply vanished. In a natural river system, a drought is a crisis, but in this artificial one, it was a catastrophic systems failure. The very design that made them prosperous in good times made them exquisitely vulnerable in bad ones. Their society, already fractured by water inequality, now faced a universal shortage. The central authority's power, which was based on controlling abundance, would have crumbled under the strain of managing scarcity. Every decision of who got water and who did not became a potential spark for conflict. But what if the climate shift brought the opposite problem? Imagine an era of unusually intense rainfall in the distant mountains, sending a wall of water down the river channel their ancestors had known. Their diversion structures and levees, engineered for a specific range of conditions, could have been utterly overwhelmed by a flood of unexpected magnitude. A single catastrophic breach could have washed away generations of labor in a matter of days, destroying the delicate sluice gates and scouring the canals down to bare rock. The civilization was caught in a perfect storm of its own making. They had built a magnificent, intricate machine perfectly calibrated for the world of yesterday. When that world changed, the machine broke. This is the timeless and haunting lesson of their story. The interplay between human ambition and planetary forces. We are left to wonder if a more flexible, adaptive relationship with their river might have allowed them to bend without breaking when the rains finally failed or the great flood came. The grand palaces and temples, once symbols of unshakable power, began to show the first visible signs of strain. If you were to walk through the ruins today, you would not see a single catastrophic destruction layer, but something far more telling, a slow decay etched into the very stones. Archaeologists find that magnificent walls, originally built with perfectly cut stone blocks, were later patched with rough mud brick. It is a clear sign that the state no longer had the resources or the skilled labor to maintain its own grandeur. The infrastructure suffered even more. Out in the desert, the farthest canals, those marvels of engineering that had pushed back the sands, were simply abandoned. Their channels, once pulsing with water, slowly filled with wind-blown dust, creating long, linear mounds that trace the outlines of a forgotten ambition. Back in the cities, the story is told in the granaries. In the lower layers, you find vast rooms packed with the carbonized remains of grain, evidence of the incredible surplus that fueled their golden age. But in the upper layers, those rooms are empty or hold only a thin scattering of seeds. This was a society that was slowly starving. its agricultural miracle faltering under the weight of salted earth and failing water. The people themselves began to retreat, abandoning outlying towns and villages to congregate in the core urban centers, a desperate clustering for safety and what little water remained. Perhaps the most poignant evidence comes not from broken pottery, but from the written word. Early inscriptions on temple walls boast of mighty kings and bountiful harvests, a confident narrative of control. Later, the tone shifts dramatically. Tablets and steles are found pleading with the gods for rain, or meticulously recording bitter legal disputes between cities over water rights. One city accuses its neighbor of secretly diverting a canal in the night, a crime that was now tantamount to theft of life itself. These are not the voices of a civilization in command of its destiny. They are the sounds of a society fraying at the edges, its central authority crumbling as every community fought for its own survival. This physical evidence, from the patched walls to the silent canals, forms a chilling timeline of decline. It shows us a people trying desperately to hold their world together, even as the very foundation of that world was turning to dust beneath their feet. Their economy was a magnificent yet terrifyingly fragile machine. Every gear and piston was driven by the steady flow of water through their man-made channels. What had once been a diverse society with farmers, herders, and traders became a monolithic agricultural state. The incredible success of their engineered farms made other ways of life seem almost irrelevant. Why herd goats on marginal lands when a single irrigated field could produce a mountain of grain? Why maintain complex trade partnerships for exotic goods when your own soil seemed to offer limitless bounty? This shift created a profound and dangerous lack of resilience. Trade routes that had once followed the river's natural, meandering path were severed or rendered useless. Ports that bustled with activity when the river emptied into the sea in its old location were left stranded, their docks sitting high and dry, miles from the new, artificial coastline. The civilization turned inward, celebrating its own self-sufficiency, unaware it was building a house of cards. This over-reliance is starkly visible in the archaeological record. There is little evidence of large-scale storage facilities built for long-term emergencies. The granaries were designed to hold the annual surplus, not to weather a decade of drought or systemic failure. This lack of foresight speaks to a deep-seated complacency, a belief that their control over the river was permanent. They had conquered nature, so why prepare for its return? When the first cracks appeared in their hydraulic empire, the economic collapse was swift and total. As crop yields dropped due to salinization and water shortages, the grain that served as the foundation of their wealth and their currency simply vanished. Famine spread not as a sudden blow but as a creeping shadow. The state, which funded its armies, its monument building, and its vast bureaucracy through agricultural taxes, found its coffers empty. How do you pay soldiers with promises when the granaries are bare? How do you organize 1,000 workers to dredge a silt-clogged canal when you cannot feed them? The entire civic structure, from the grandest temple to the most local administrator, lost its funding and its purpose. This economic unraveling would have been felt in every home, from the royal palace to the simplest mud-brick dwelling. It was a slow-motion catastrophe where prosperity turned to poverty not in a flash, but in a relentless, quiet dimming. The civilization's cultural spirit, which had once soared with such ambition, now faced its ultimate test in the growing silence of the empty markets and the hollow echo of hunger. The gods themselves seemed to change their faces. In the civilization's golden age, the deities carved into temple walls were serene partners in a grand enterprise, often depicted handing the tools of engineering to the ruling kings. These were gods of order and abundance, divine sponsors of the great reversal, their stone smiles blessing the human ambition that had tamed the river. The artistic message was one of confident alliance, a sacred justification for their monumental control over the natural world. But as the fields began to fail and the canals ran low, a new and terrifying theme emerged in their sacred art. The benevolent gods of the harvest were joined, or perhaps replaced, by wrathful deities of drought and scorching winds. Sculptures began to show chaotic, fanged spirits representing the very river they had bent to their will, now portrayed as a betrayed and vengeful force. This was more than a shift in artistic style. It was a fundamental rewriting of their relationship with the cosmos. The rituals that had once been stately ceremonies of gratitude transformed into frantic, communal pleas for mercy. Where they once offered the first fruits of a bountiful harvest, they now likely sacrificed their most precious livestock, even their own treasured possessions, casting them into the dwindling waters as desperate offerings to appease an angry spirit. The constant, rhythmic chanting for rain would have echoed through the streets, a sound not of faith in human power, but of profound fear. Imagine the psychological toll on a farmer who had been raised to believe his people were the masters of creation, now on his knees begging the sky for a deliverance that never came. Their entire identity, built upon the pillar of control, was crumbling into dust. This cultural collapse from hubris to helplessness may have been the most devastating failure of all, severing the spiritual bond that held the society together and leaving them utterly lost in a world they no longer understood. The final collapse likely began with a sound no one had ever heard before, a deep, groaning crack that echoed not through the mountains but from the heart of their own creation. It could have been the main diversion dam, its earthen core saturated by years of silt, and then overwhelmed by a freak storm it was never designed to withstand. Or perhaps it was a critical levee, its maintenance neglected as the state's resources dwindled, that simply gave way under the relentless pressure. This was not the slow creep of salinization or the quiet hunger of drought. This was a sudden, violent rupture in the civilization's central artery. The very structure that symbolized their ultimate control over nature became, in an instant, the instrument of their utter destruction. The result was an unstoppable torrent, but not the life-giving flood of old. This was a savage release of pent-up water that scoured the landscape, tearing through the intricate network of secondary canals, washing away sluice gates, and obliterating the carefully graded channels that had been their claim to greatness. In a matter of days, perhaps even hours, the hydraulic system that sustained millions was reduced to a chaotic jumble of mud and rubble. The heartland, which for generations had enjoyed a guaranteed flow of water, was now completely cut off. The disaster would have triggered immediate and widespread chaos. Think of the farmers watching the destructive wave recede, leaving not fertile mud behind, but a desolate, gullied wasteland where their fields once stood. In the cities, the public fountains would have sputtered and fallen silent. The granaries, already depleted, now had no hope of replenishment. The social order, already fractured by inequality, would have shattered completely. How do you maintain the authority of a water administrator when there is no water left to administer? How do you command an army of laborers to rebuild when they are desperately searching for a single drink of water for their children? This was a systems failure so total it made recovery impossible. The knowledge of how to repair the damage still existed in the minds of their engineers, but the society itself no longer had the unity, the resources, or the will to do so. The point of no return had been crossed. The civilization did not simply fade away after this catastrophe. It effectively vanished, its people scattered by thirst and famine, its great cities left to the encroaching sands. Their golden age ended not with a whimper, but with the terrifying roar of their own hubris coming undone. The great river's final silence was not an empty one. It was filled with the footsteps of those leaving everything behind. Where did an entire civilization go when its heart stopped beating? The most likely answer is that they simply walked away. Picture a slow, agonizing exodus from the cities that could no longer support them. Families gathered what few possessions they could carry, abandoning their ancestral homes to follow the whispers of distant water sources. These were not organized relocations but desperate, scattered flights. As these refugees reached the lands of their neighbors, they did not arrive as conquerors but as supplicants. Over generations, their distinct language, their customs, and their unique identity would have slowly faded, absorbed into the larger cultural tapestry of the peoples who took them in. Their legacy became a subtle thread woven into the fabric of others, their own story forgotten. Another, darker possibility is that they did not leave in peace. A civilization in such visible distress, its granaries empty and its armies unpaid, would have been a tempting target for rival powers or nomadic raiders. The Great Walls, once a symbol of imperial strength, now guarded only hollowed-out cities and starving populations. An invasion would not have needed to be a great, epic battle. It could have been a series of brutal, efficient raids, seizing what little wealth remained and enslaving the weakened populace. The survivors of such conflicts would have been scattered to the winds, their social structure shattered beyond any hope of recovery. The last members of this once great culture might have ended their days in foreign lands, not as integrated immigrants but as conquered peoples, their history erased by the swords of their enemies. Perhaps the most profound ending, however, is not one of violence or flight, but of quiet dissolution. After the central authority collapsed, the grand idea of a unified civilization may have simply lost its meaning. People reverted to what they knew best, forming smaller, localized communities that could be sustained by wells and seasonal rains. The identity that was once bound up in the glory of the reversed river and the power of the king no longer served a purpose. Why teach your children the old prayers for a river that no longer flowed? Why maintain the elaborate rituals for a priesthood that had lost its power? Their cultural memory, once so robust, faded with each passing generation, until the people who had built the marvels were no different from any other village dwellers in the region. They did not vanish from the earth, they vanished from history, their grand narrative fragmenting into 1,000 quiet, unrecorded lives. The truth of their disappearance likely holds a piece of each of these stories, a complex tapestry of migration, conflict, and assimilation. Their world did not end with a single event, but with a slow unraveling until the only thing left was the wind whispering through the ruins of their impossible dream. The ghost of their civilization is still visible from the air. Modern satellite technology, peering through layers of sand and time, reveals the astonishing geometry of their ambition. Etched into the desert floor are the pale, spectral lines of their main canals, branching out like a vast, fossilized tree. These are not natural formations, but the stark imprint of a human plan, a network so extensive it dwarfs even the most sprawling modern cities. On the ground, archaeologists carefully brush dust from the foundations of a common home. They find no treasure, only the quiet story of a life interrupted. A stone grain grinder sits in the corner, abandoned mid-task. Pottery jars, once filled with oil or grain, lie shattered where they fell. These are not the relics of a planned departure, but of a sudden, final exit. The most telling evidence often comes from the trash heaps, where layers of discarded animal bones and broken tools show a slow, grim decline from a diet rich in beef and imported goods to one of scrawny desert hares and wild grasses. Then there is the mud itself. Scientists take core samples from the dried-up riverbeds and ancient lake bottoms, pulling up long cylinders of accumulated history. Within those layers, they can read the story of the water itself. Tiny pollen grains trapped in the sediment tell them what plants were thriving and when. The chemical composition of the mud reveals periods of extreme salinity, confirming the tragic spread of poisoned earth. These physical clues are like pages from a lost diary, each one adding a sentence to the narrative of their collapse. An inscription on a broken clay tablet might record a desperate prayer for rain, while the worn-down teeth on a skeleton speak to a lifetime of chewing gritty, dust-contaminated bread. We are no longer just reconstructing their architecture, we are piecing together their lived experience, their daily struggles, and their final, desperate days. These echoes in the sand give us the raw facts of their story, but to truly understand its meaning, we must listen for the same patterns in other fallen empires. This pattern of creation and collapse echoes across the deserts of time. We find a hauntingly similar story etched into the ruins of Mesopotamia, where the very cradle of civilization was nurtured by intricate irrigation canals. For centuries, these networks turned the land between the Tigris and Euphrates into a breadbasket, supporting mighty cities like and Babylon. Their engineers were masters of their domain, yet over time, their fields too were choked by a familiar white crust of salt. The same tragedy unfolded in the American Southwest, where the Hohokam people carved over 800 miles of canals into the arid landscape of what is now Arizona. They flourished for generations, creating a vibrant culture in a seemingly impossible environment, only to fade away as their water systems faltered under prolonged drought and perhaps social upheaval. Then there is the contrasting case of the Khmer Empire at anchor. Their vast, sprawling city was sustained by an elaborate system of reservoirs called barrays and canals that managed the monsoon floods. They achieved a remarkable balance that lasted for 6 centuries, a testament to a system built with more resilience and adaptability. So why did some succeed where others failed? The critical difference often lies not in the scale of the engineering, but in the flexibility of the society behind it. A civilization that becomes rigid, that stakes its entire identity on controlling a single, unchanging version of nature, builds a trap for itself. When the climate shifts or the environment rebels, that society has no plan B. It cannot adapt because its entire culture, economy, and power structure are invested in maintaining a system that is suddenly broken. The civilization that reversed its river represents the ultimate expression of this rigidity. Their triumph was so complete, so absolute, that it left no room for error. By comparing their fate to others, we see that the true danger is not ambitious engineering itself, but the human hubris that follows, the belief that we have finally solved the puzzle and can stop listening to the world around us. What universal warning does this recurring pattern hold for our own modern world? With its vast cities and complex infrastructures, the land still remembers what history has forgotten. Long after the last inhabitants departed, the ghost of their engineering lingered, permanently etching their ambition into the very geology of the region. The river, once persuaded into its new bed, may have refused to return to its original course. Over centuries, that man-made channel became the new normal, the only river future generations would ever know. Lush wetlands that once teemed with life at the old river mouth were replaced by arid plains, while new, unexpected deltas formed far from their natural location, creating entirely different ecosystems where none had existed before. This was not a temporary change, but a permanent rearrangement of the continent's plumbing. The most enduring scar, however, lies in the soil itself. Walk across those abandoned fields today, and in some places you can still find a faint, white crust shimmering under the sun. This is the legacy of their irrigation, a toxic salt deposit that has poisoned the earth for thousands of years. Rainwater alone cannot wash it away. The land's natural ability to heal itself was fundamentally broken, leaving these areas barren long after the civilization that created the problem had turned to dust. Even underground, their legacy persists. The massive, buried earthworks of their dams and canal beds continue to act as unintended dams, silently redirecting subterranean aquifers and influencing where water can and cannot flow. Modern wells drilled in the area might run dry because of an unseen, ancient wall of compacted clay that blocks the path of an underground stream. This is the profound and unsettling truth of their story. Our most monumental efforts to control the environment can create a geological legacy that far outlasts our cities, our languages, and our very memory. The choices they made, driven by immediate need and towering pride, literally reshaped their world for millennia. It forces our uncomfortable question into the present. What permanent scars are we creating right now? The concrete channels, the diverted waterways, the vast agricultural systems of our own era, are they not our own version of reversing the river? We are now the ancient engineers, and the future will read our story in the layers of the earth we leave behind. We are now the ancient engineers staring at our own rivers. Across our modern world, the same patterns are repeating, echoing that ancient gamble on a monumental scale. Consider the American Southwest, where the mighty Colorado River is so heavily diverted for cities and farms that it often runs dry before reaching the sea. Vast reservoirs like Lake Mead, which supply millions, are shrinking to record lows, their bathtub rings etched into the canyon walls like warnings. In Central Asia, the fate of the Aral Sea stands as one of the most devastating environmental disasters in human history. Soviet engineers diverted the rivers that fed it to irrigate cotton fields, turning what was once the world's fourth largest lake into a barren, salty desert. We see the same story in the relentless depletion of ancient aquifers, underground water reserves that took millennia to fill, now being pumped out in mere decades to feed our own agricultural empires. These are not isolated crises. They are symptoms of the same old story, a belief that our technology can endlessly redefine the limits of nature. The ancient civilization's fatal flaw was not their ambition, but their blindness to the slow, accumulating consequences of their triumph. They saw the river as a resource to be controlled, not as the heart of a living system. Our current water management crises are a direct parallel. We build ever larger dams and drill ever deeper wells, focusing on the immediate delivery of water while ignoring the long-term health of the entire watershed. The lesson carved into their ruins is not that we should abandon engineering, but that we must marry it with profound humility. Our policies must prioritize resilience over sheer control. This means designing systems that can absorb shocks like drought or flood, rather than shatter under them. It means valuing adaptable, local water sources and diversified agriculture instead of betting everything on one massive, centralized scheme. It means finally listening to the natural limits that the land itself has always tried to teach us. Their civilization vanished because they failed to see that their greatest achievement was also their greatest vulnerability. As we confront our own uncertain hydrological future, we are left to wonder what future archaeologists will find when they sift through the layers of our own choices. Will they see the moment we finally learned the lesson, or just another civilization that chose to repeat the same tragic mistake? The true story of this civilization did not vanish completely. Instead, it was slowly filtered through the lens of memory, transforming from documented history into powerful myth. Imagine a story passed down for 1,000 years around campfires, told and retold by people who only knew the ruins left behind. In the folklore of their neighbors, this great culture likely became a cautionary tale, a legendary kingdom of immense pride that dared to challenge the natural order. The river reversal, a feat of engineering, would have been recast as an act of cosmic defiance. The civilization's downfall was no longer a complex ecological collapse, but a simple, divine punishment from angry gods or river spirits they had offended. This is how human societies often process traumatic and inexplicable events from the deep past. They simplify the chain of cause and effect into a moral fable about the dangers of arrogance. Centuries later, these local legends might have reached the ears of early historians like Herodotus, the great Greek traveler who collected wondrous stories from the ancient world. He would have written down a garbled, fantastical version of events, perhaps describing a king who commanded a river to flow backwards and was struck down for his impiety. His account would mix a few genuine details, like the existence of a mighty kingdom in that location, with impossible exaggerations and supernatural explanations. The intricate, slow-moving disaster of salinization and social fracture is replaced in these myths by a single, dramatic act of godly wrath. Yet, buried within the fantasy is that essential, haunting kernel of truth, the persistent memory that a great power once fell because of its own overreach. This process of how history becomes myth is not just about inaccuracy. It is a profound psychological mechanism. When a catastrophe is too vast and complex to explain, the human mind seeks a narrative it can understand, one that often carries a moral lesson. The story is reshaped to fit the cultural values and fears of the people telling it. For them, the ruins on the horizon were a permanent reminder that there are limits, that some lines should not be crossed. This transformation from fact to fable is a critical part of our investigation. It forces us to look at these myths not as simple fairy tales, but as cultural echoes of a real seismic event. By understanding how these stories were preserved and distorted, we learn to listen for the truth whispering within the legend. This act of separating the historical signal from the mythological noise is our next step, a delicate process of reconstruction that relies on more than just whispered stories from the past. Uncovering this story demands more than just trowels and brushes. It requires a suite of technologies that feel like something from science fiction. High above the desert, aircraft equipped with LiDAR scanners fire millions of laser pulses at the ground. This technology can essentially strip away the vegetation and surface sand, creating a detailed three-dimensional map of the terrain below, and revealing the ghostly outlines of buried canals, foundations, and roads that are completely invisible from the ground. Where LiDAR gives us the broad picture, ground-penetrating radar provides the close-up view. By sending radar waves into the earth and listening to the echoes, archaeologists can locate hidden walls, tombs, and even ancient refuse pits without ever breaking the soil. It is like giving the land an X-ray, allowing us to see the skeleton of the civilization still lying just beneath the surface. But what was the world like when these structures were alive? That story is told by paleobotanists, scientists who study ancient plant life. They take core samples from the sediment of long, dry lake beds and examine the tiny, nearly indestructible pollen grains trapped within. By identifying these grains, they can reconstruct the entire landscape, proving when it was a lush, farmed paradise and pinpointing the exact moment it reverted to scrubland and dust. Meanwhile, other scientists turn to the human remains themselves. Through isotope analysis, they can read the chemical signatures locked inside ancient bones and teeth. The specific mix of elements reveals what a person ate and even where they sourced their water, telling us if an individual lived their whole life in one city or was a migrant who arrived from a distant, dying region. And then there are the words they left behind. Epigraphers painstakingly decipher any surviving texts, whether carved on a broken monument or inked on a fragile piece of pottery. They are the code breakers, transforming cryptic symbols into human voices, translating royal decrees, merchant inventories, and those desperate prayers for rain. Each of these advanced techniques peels back another layer of time, moving us from myth and speculation into the realm of evidence. This is not a static picture. Our understanding is constantly evolving as the technology improves. Every new method promises that future discoveries may yet rewrite the entire narrative of this civilization. What profound secrets still lie buried, waiting for the right tool to finally give them a voice? For all our advanced technology and careful digging, fundamental gaps remain in our understanding of this people. We still do not know what they called themselves. Their true name is lost. Their native language is a series of undeciphered symbols on clay tablets, a code that no one has yet been able to crack. We refer to them with a label given by their neighbors or by modern archaeologists, a placeholder for an identity that has completely vanished. The exact trigger for the final, irreversible collapse is also a subject of intense debate. Was it that single, catastrophic failure of the main diversion structure, or was it a slower, final tipping point reached after generations of decline? A moment when the last functioning well ran dry and the last vestige of social order dissolved. We can see the empty granaries and the patched walls, but we cannot see the council meetings where the crisis was discussed. Were there prophets of doom who stood before the ruling class and warned them of the salinization and the social unrest, only to be dismissed as alarmists? What was the daily experience of a common farmer during those final years? We can infer the hunger from the skeletal remains, but we cannot know his thoughts as he watched his children grow thin, or the despair he felt when he abandoned the land his family had worked for centuries. The personal stories, the final conversations, the very last day in the great cities, these intimate human moments are lost to time, leaving only silent stones and scattered bones. Yet these gaps are not failures of scholarship. They are instead powerful invitations for future discovery. Every unanswered question is a door that remains open, a puzzle waiting for the next generation of researchers or a new piece of technology to solve. This incomplete picture reminds us that history is not a closed book full of settled facts. It is a continuous, living dialogue with the past. We are always asking new questions, and the silent evidence, when examined with fresh eyes, sometimes offers startling new answers. This dialogue becomes profoundly more compelling when we move beyond the mere facts of their collapse and begin to ask what their story means for our own understanding of human ambition. What does this ancient catastrophe tell us about the very nature of civilization itself? Their story is a philosophical riddle written in sand and stone. At its core, this is a tragedy of hubris, that ancient Greek concept of arrogant pride that invites a catastrophic fall. Their fatal flaw was not in their engineering, but in their belief that their control was absolute and permanent. They crossed a line from being participants in their ecosystem to believing they were its commanders, and the system ultimately pushed back with overwhelming force. This ancient collapse directly challenges a deeply held modern faith, the idea that for every problem, from climate change to resource scarcity, there is a technological silver bullet waiting in a lab. Their history suggests a more uncomfortable truth, that our most brilliant solutions can become the source of our next greater crisis if they are not tempered with wisdom. The most vital lesson they bequeath to us is not one of engineering, but of humility. It is the recognition that we exist within a complex, living web of cause and effect, not outside of it. We can pull one thread like the flow of a river, but we cannot possibly predict how the entire tapestry will unravel. our power to reshape the world has far outpaced our understanding of its long-term consequences. This is the enduring, haunting legacy of their vanished world. It serves as a permanent reminder that the greatest danger to any civilization may not be a lack of ambition, but a surplus of confidence in its own control. As we look at our own planet with its own rewired rivers and altered atmospheres, their silence speaks directly to our future. The next chapter of their story is literally waiting beneath the sands. Scattered across remote, inhospitable stretches of desert are entire cities and administrative centers that have never felt the touch of an archaeologist's trowel. One such unexcavated mound could conceal a royal archive, a sealed room filled with clay tablets that finally reveals their true name and the specific reasons their leaders made that fateful decision to reverse the river. The personal diaries of a water engineer or the financial records of a merchant guild could transform our understanding from broad speculation into intimate, documented history. Beyond these hidden libraries, the story is also written in the bones of the people themselves. Imagine the power of advanced ancient DNA analysis applied to skeletons from different periods of their history. This technology could trace the genetic journey of their population as the collapse unfolded. Did groups from the desiccated south migrate en masse to the still-watered north, creating genetic signatures of a desperate, final internal migration? Could we find the descendants of these refugees alive today, living in distant communities, carrying a forgotten ancestry in their very cells, completely unaware of their connection to the great river reversal? Furthermore, our understanding of their environmental context is becoming ever more precise. New, high-resolution climate models, fed with data from ice cores and seabed sediments, are now attempting to reconstruct the weather of the past with astonishing detail. Scientists may soon be able to tell us not just that a drought occurred, but its exact duration and intensity. They could model the specific storm that likely breached their main dam, or chart the decade when the rains failed so completely that no amount of engineering could have saved them. This moves the narrative from a vague idea of climate change to a precise timeline of catastrophe, and we must not forget their neighbors. In the ruins of a contemporaneous kingdom 100 miles away, a broken monument or a diplomatic letter might be discovered that mentions the great upheaval next door. A foreign scribe's account of a sudden influx of starving refugees, or a record of a cancelled trade route due to the river's new course, would provide an external, time-stamped confirmation of the collapse. Each of these potential discoveries represents a single piece of a vast, interconnected puzzle. This relentless, evolving quest ensures their story is never truly finished. It is a powerful reminder that history is not a static record of what we already know, but a living discipline driven by the questions we have yet to answer. We can hear their story in the debates over our own great rivers. Modern engineers designing massive dam projects now routinely study cases like this vanished civilization, using their failure as a critical stress test for new designs. The question is no longer just can we build it, but what are the second and third order consequences if we do? This ancient collapse directly informs modern environmental impact assessments, forcing planners to model scenarios far into the future, considering everything from soil salinity to downstream social equity. The civilization's ghost haunts our policy rooms, a cautionary tale that has helped shift the paradigm from sheer domination of nature to a more nuanced goal of resilient coexistence. In the global conversation about climate change, their history is a powerful narrative device. It provides a tangible, human-scale story for abstract concepts like systemic risk and long-term vulnerability. When a scientist warns that our current path could lead to cascading failures, we can point to a real society that experienced exactly that, a civilization brought down not by a single enemy, but by a chain reaction they themselves set in motion. This has made their story a potent motif in literature and film, where it symbolizes the peril of technological arrogance and the fragile beauty of human achievement. For any person living in a modern city, their tale prompts a quiet, personal reflection. As you turn on your tap and water flows effortlessly out, do you ever consider the vast, invisible system that brings it to you? How different is our reliance on complex infrastructure from their dependence on those canals? Their ruins stand as a permanent question mark against our own sense of permanence. We are forced to ask what foundations our own society is built upon, and whether they might be just as vulnerable to a slow, accumulating strain. This ancient drama is not locked in the past. It is a living part of our collective consciousness, a timeless echo that shapes how we plan, build, and ultimately, how we choose to remember our own place in the long arc of history. Their legacy is a final, silent testament to the breathtaking scale of human ambition and its profound limits. We have walked with them from the first spark of a radical idea, through the monumental labor of its creation, and into the golden age of engineered prosperity. We witnessed the slow, creeping unraveling as salted earth and fractured society took their toll, and we felt the final, thunderous collapse of the very system they built to last forever. This is not merely a story of a people who failed, but of a people who soared so high that their fall became an eternal lesson. The mosaic of their history pieces together a universal truth that our most brilliant innovations are inextricably linked to the environments they alter, and that no amount of power can erase the fundamental need for balance. Let the ghost of their civilization stand as a permanent marker in time, a reminder that our own towering achievements must be guided by wisdom and a deep, abiding respect for the natural world we are a part of. This journey into their lost world may have ended, but the conversation it sparks is vital for our own future. If these echoes from the dust have resonated with you, I invite you to share your reflections and questions below, and to join us as we continue to uncover the deepest mysteries of our shared human story.